Hello. You're listening to the Bitcoin Advocate podcast. I am your host, Andy, and if you're new here, welcome. This is a show where we discuss all things Bitcoin on a weekly basis. This is a show that I wish I had when I first got into Bitcoin, which is why I started this podcast. This is your one-stop shop of complex topics in the wonderful world of Bitcoin, explained in simple ways. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Music, and a whole bunch of other platforms. So, wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/thebtcadvocate. Today's episode is sponsored by myself. More specifically, I have a book about Bitcoin called Hyper-Bitcoinization, A Story About a Revolution. And if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a link down below in the description. Otherwise, you can search for the title on Amazon and should be the first result. It's not selling out if it's my own product. Last week, we discussed inflation versus deflation and how, although we've been taught that inflation is good, upon evaluation, inflation is neither good nor necessary for a free and fair economy. We discussed various ways that the wealthy elites have used the mechanism of inflation, that is the signature of our fiat monetary system, to enrich themselves at the expense of everyday working class people. We discussed how inflation is immoral since it leads to the waste of resources, which is the result of rampant consumerism and frivolous spending as people buy things not for the sake of using them, but for the sake of not having to hold on to their fiat money since it is depreciating due to inflation. This week, we'll continue with our discussion on moral reasons why Bitcoin should succeed, setting aside technological and economic reasons for just a moment. To begin, when people first learn about Bitcoin, they often misunderstand the mechanisms that are used to back Bitcoin, such as the energy that is needed to mine it, as well as the global decentralized computer network that is used to keep record of the blockchain. Then, skeptics mistakenly believe and claim that Bitcoin is backed by nothing, and proudly exclaim that the US dollar, a fiat currency, is backed by the US military, the most powerful military in the world. What the arguer of this claim failed to understand was that backed by military is not a compliment to the US dollar. It should be, in fact, a criticism of the US dollar. This is because the implication here is that fiat currency, in this case the US dollar, fundamentally requires violence or the threat of violence to back it, meaning that the value of the US dollar is enforced by pointing the barrel of a gun at someone. The implicit message is you better accept US dollars as money, and you better believe that it has value, and you better price goods like oil in US dollars, and if you don't, well then you can answer to my military. So if the value of the money is determined by who has the bigger gun, then eventually other countries who want to push their own fiat currency will naturally be required to try to outbuild your military with an even more powerful one, starting an arms race. This implicit threat of violence even extends to the relationship between a country's government and its citizens. In pretty much all countries around the world, payment of taxes is required to be made in the country's fiat currency. If you run a business that is a certain size or bigger, your government will force you to accept the legal tender that is the fiat currency of that country. If you were to say, I don't want to deal with this fiat money because I don't believe it has any value since it's just paper, well then prepare for a visit from the police or regulators for breaking the rules of legal tender. And the fiat monetary system gives you no way to opt out of this. You can't simply just say, I don't believe in fiat anymore, because you would get in trouble with the police. If you're a small country and you have a resource like oil, which the United States really wants, you can't just say, I don't believe the US dollar because the Federal Reserve can just print it out of thin air, give me gold instead. If that's the case, then the US can and will use all types of tactics, including threatening to use, or actually use, their military against you, until you either give in or get overthrown. And I know it sounds like I'm picking on the United States, and this may rub some of my American listeners the wrong way, but to be fair, I don't think this situation would be any different if it was any other country. Imagine that instead of the United States, it was China or Russia as the world's strongest superpower. They would be doing the exact same thing. I'm not saying that the US is a bad country. I'm just saying that the way the fiat monetary system is set up necessitates violence or the threat of violence to keep it going. Thus, the problem here is obvious. Fiat money is bad at preventing conflict. Throughout humanity's history, most wars are fought over the allocation of resources. Say if there's a piece of land that is in your country, but my country has a bigger army, well then why don't I just invade you and take it? The only thing that stands in my way is that wars are expensive, and if I run out of money, I would have to stop fighting, and the war machine grinds to a halt. The Romans frequently experienced this problem nearing the end of the Western Roman Empire as they started to run out of gold to mint coins to pay their soldiers. However, in the modern day, running out of money to pay for an army does not really apply anymore, at least not to the same extent, since a government can just continuously print money to fund the army. Since fiat is created out of thin air and backed by the army, if I were to create some money out of thin air and to use it to pay my army and grow it even bigger, isn't that just the perfect solution? Well, the argument sounds a little circular, but it's essentially what every country in the world is doing currently, and the worst part about it is, it works to an extent. Fiat money allows you to expand a military more than you can with the hard money such as gold, and also conveniently provides an incentive for a country to expand its military since its fiat relies on the military to give it value. So if fiat is so problematic, then would switching to gold help the situation? Like what we just discussed a moment ago, if countries still use gold as money, then they would be forced to stop a war once they ran out of gold. Then countries would naturally have to think twice before going to war, since it would be a disaster if a country was at war and it ran out of gold halfway. This would incentivize more diplomatic solutions over violent conflict. So, problem solved, right? Well, it sounds simple, except the problem with this logic is that if we were to use gold, the gold itself would become a target and a reason to go to war. Say if gold was the only form of money and you were a country with a large army but running out of gold soon, and you see a small rich country with a small army but flush with gold, then you might think to yourself, if I invade that country, then I can just take their gold. Remember what I said about most wars in history being fought over resources. Resources include land, energy, food, water, and of course, money. So with gold, you might end up with wars anyways because the gold itself would be one of those resources that people would fight over. Okay, so back to the drawing board. Let's think about another asset that if we were to use as money, it would at least in theory reduce the amount of wars. Well, recall how in episode 5 we talked about the 6 properties of money for Bitcoin, and there was a bonus category that I mentioned that could be interesting and could be of help here. I'll jog your memory. It is the property of non-confiscatability. Recall that non-confiscatability describes an asset's inability to be confiscated, and by confiscated I mean taken away from you against your will. So when it comes to the scale of countries, confiscation of wealth means that you got invaded by another country and the invaders took your land or your money. So I mentioned that with Bitcoin, the most common way to store Bitcoin is with a seed phrase, which is a list of 12 or 24 English words chosen from a special list that, when put together in a specific order, generates a tree of private keys. We'll talk about this in more detail in another episode of exactly how this works, but all you need to know right now is that although a seed phrase is how you may choose to store your Bitcoin, when it comes to the scale of a treasury of an entire country, there are more sophisticated ways to store Bitcoin. For instance, never mind a country, but even a large enough company would most likely use a multi-sig solution for storing Bitcoin. Multi-sig is short for multiple signatures and is a method of Bitcoin storage where no one person or entity controls all the private keys that are needed to access a Bitcoin address. For example, you can generate 5 private keys where a threshold of 3 out of the 5 keys are needed to move the Bitcoin from an address. So you can get 4 of your most trusted friends and family to each hold a different key while you hold on to one as well. As long as you can ensure that 3 or more of the trusted parties don't collude to steal your Bitcoin is safe. Another benefit of multisig is that if you lose your key, as long as you can still get enough keys together to meet the threshold that you set, in this example is 3 out of 5, you can still recover your Bitcoin. In practice, if you want to be extra secure, you don't even want to trust your family and friends if they're not well versed in Bitcoin storage practices, since they might lose their copies of your keys. So there are actual companies out there that specialize in holding multi-sig keys. And again, you may opt to trust multiple companies who don't know or talk to each other just to make sure that they don't collude. And once again, one copy of the key is not enough to access the Bitcoin, so a company with their copy of the key alone cannot unilaterally steal your Bitcoin. The reason why I had to explain all of that is just to open your eyes as to how hard it would be to actually steal someone's Bitcoin, assuming that that person has done their Bitcoin storage properly. If you were doing Bitcoin storage for an entire country, you might opt to have a huge multi-sig setup where you get 1,000 people to hold 1,000 different keys and set the threshold to, 750. So if your country gets invaded, if the invader tries to steal your country's treasury, they will have to find at least 750 people out of the original 1,000 and coerce them to all give up their keys. These 1,000 people could be situated anywhere, so for safety, you might want to situate them overseas, and their identities may be disguised. This will be incredibly hard for an invading country to track down enough of them and get them to reveal their private keys. Also, nobody said you had to keep all your Bitcoin in one wallet. What if you spread your country's treasury over 1,000 different multi-sig wallets? And there are probably even more advanced ways and storage methods that I'm not even aware of that's even more advanced than multi-sig. Maybe you combine it with another method. And this is why Bitcoin is called non-confiscatable, since if you really wanted to prevent someone from getting to it, there's 1,000,001 ways to practically make it impossible for someone to get to it, assuming that you don't make a mistake in security somewhere. So my point is that if a country were to use Bitcoin as money, there will be no way for another country to acquire that country's wealth through an invasion. This is not the same for any other form of money. Again, if it's gold, since it's a physical object, they can just invade you and take it. With Bitcoin, if you get invaded and your country, even if it gets taken over, you would actually still have your money. And the only way for a country to get your Bitcoin would be to trade with you, to get you to willingly give up your Bitcoin in exchange for some good or service. This is what is meant by Bitcoin is peace. If we were to use Bitcoin as money, everyone would recognize that there is no way you can cheat the system, there's no way you can just brute force take away somebody's money, and you don't need to back up your money with the barrel of a gun. Everyone has to play fair, everyone has to play by the rules, and give up something of value trading with one another if they want some money. I want to spend the latter half of today's episode speaking a little bit more on the topic of how Bitcoin promotes freedom around the world. Back in the 1800s, there were several mining towns that popped up all over the United States and parts of Canada, and these towns would essentially be owned by a single company that also owned the mine. Everyone in the town worked in the mine. And I'm not talking about mining Bitcoin, by the way. I'm talking about actually mining, often with no safety equipment and no safety oversights. Because remember, this was back in the 1800s. So not only did the workers have a horribly short life expectancy from breathing in the toxic chemicals all day, they'd also be paid in a special currency called company Scrip. Company Scrip was essentially the company's own fiat currency. It can be used to buy things only at company-owned stores in the town and was useless outside of the town. So this is how the company forced you to stay and work despite the horrible conditions. You can never get wealthy or save money because you're getting paid in a currency that is controlled by the same company. The company would also be freely able to manipulate the currency, and if they wanted to squeeze in a higher profit margin, instead of cutting people's pay, which would start a riot, they would just quietly increase the price of some items in the store. So I think many of you would agree that using company Scrip to control workers would be a violation of human rights and a violation of workers' freedoms. But if you think about it, a country's fiat currency, isn't that just the same thing but on a less extreme scale? Maybe Americans don't feel this way because the US dollar is widely accepted worldwide, but what about other countries? If you're from Vietnam or if you're from the Central African Republic, you'll probably find that your currency is not spendable elsewhere, and the fact alone may limit your mobility or your ease of access to certain goods and services. Most of the listeners of this show are probably from developed countries, and you have access to banks and financial services. So most of us probably can't think of a scenario where we won't be able to get a loan or have a savings account or apply for a mortgage. However, the reality is that 1.7 billion people around the world, according to data from a Forbes article in 2018, do not have access to banking services at all. Even in developed countries such as the United States, there are as many as 5.9 million people who do not have a bank account. This can be for a variety of reasons, like maybe they don't have ID, or the bank thinks that they're just too risky to provide services to, so they rejected them, or they can't afford the $5 per month account fees that some banks charge, or there are simply no banks where they live. What Bitcoin does is that it lowers the requirement for ease of access to financial services. All you need to do to get started in Bitcoin is a $50 smartphone and access to the internet. Literally, that is it. With those two things, and with the help of layer 2 technology such as the Lightning Network, you can transact in Bitcoin fearlessly and instantly. This is tremendously powerful. The reason why we can't use traditional finance systems like Visa or MasterCard is that they don't provide service in some countries, they require a banking infrastructure, or their fees are simply too expensive for some people. Some of you would recall that in 2021, the country of El Salvador made the news as it has become the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. And I know that in the developed world, we don't often pay much attention to smaller countries like El Salvador, whose influence on the world stage is limited. But to that, I like to share with you the parable of the boy and the starfish. So the story goes one day, a man is walking near a beach and he sees a boy throwing starfish back into the ocean. These starfish have washed up on the beach after a storm recently. The man asks the boy what he's doing, and the boy says he's trying to save the starfish because if they can't get back into the ocean by themselves, they'll die if not returned. The man laughs and says, "Boy, you see this entire beach is full of starfish. You cannot save them all. Better give up because no one cares." The boy picks up a starfish and says, "This one cares," throws it back into the ocean. He picks up another one and says, "This one also cares," and also throws it back into the ocean. The point I'm trying to make is that if you look up stories of El Salvador's Bitcoin adoption, the media will tell you that it has failed. But that is simply not true. Admittedly, not everything has gone perfectly smoothly, but every day I'm hearing stories of people in El Salvador who used to bike or walk for hours just to pay their water bill each month, who can now save both time and energy and money, which would otherwise go to processing fees and biking to the bank, just by paying with Bitcoin from the comfort of their own homes. We should not underestimate the benefits of freeing up human potential and allowing people to focus on other things rather than having them do meaningless tasks like wasting hours every day or month just to go to a bank to pay a bill. Imagine the human potential we can unlock if we adopted a fast, modern, sound monetary system that also promotes peace and makes the rules of money fair for everyone. That is the potential of Bitcoin. And with that, I think it's a good place to end the episode. Next week, we'll talk about the Byzantine generals problem and how Bitcoin solves this problem using what's called Nakamoto consensus. Find out what that's all about next week. But for now, we'll wrap it up here. Have a good week, everyone. Bye-bye.